Welcome back to Normalized PTSD. Today we got Dan Jarvis. He's the founder, president of 220. He's going to discuss with us the conception of how 220 got started, their mission, their purpose, and I really enjoy his story. So I hope you guys find something useful in it. And with that, here we go. Today we're met with Dan Jarvis. You're the founder of 220. And I got connected with you all through a mutual friend named Tia. Tia spoke very highly of what you guys offer and perform, and I just wanted to talk to you and be like, who are you? How'd you get involved? How to get started? How the concept came? Like, I'm just really interested.
Hey, Jonathan, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience. My name is Dan Jarvis. I was the founder of 220. We formulated the nonprofit in April of 2018. It was literally right after I left law enforcement for the second time. And for me, it was just a kind of a way to kind of be a stopgap for men and women who put those uniforms on, to find resources out there to help them. And this came out of my experience with the Department of Veterans Affairs. When I left law enforcement, I was really finding myself struggling, and I didn't have a badge to worry about nor a security clearance to worry about. So I decided to take my ex-wife's advice and go get treatment. So went to the VA, and of course the VA, their first thing is, here, take these pills. And then they do what's called exposure therapy, prolonged exposure. And you're re-experiencing the traumatic event that you're working on repeatedly for the whole session. So they have you tell the story over and over and over, for the whole hour session that you're in there. And then they have you do things like record the conversation, and then they want you to listen to that story being retold throughout the week until your next appointment. So basically what ends up happening is, with exposure therapy, it basically reactivates all the neural pathways. So your body will literally start feeling the emotions that you felt at the moment of the events, the traumatic events. And I mean, it's high anxiety, gets you pretty stressed out, but what they're trying to do is get you accustomed to being uncomfortable.
Right.
So I did 2 appointments with the VA, and then the third appointment was coming around the corner, and then the VA canceled my third appointment. And so I said, well, when can I get back in to see the psychologist? And they're like, well, he doesn't have an availability for 4 weeks.
Yeah.
So now they've opened up those wounds, and you're left out there hanging for 4 weeks. And then I go to that third appointment, and it was either that after that one, or I might have done 2 more appointments, and then they had canceled a second appointment. And when I checked in, I said, well, when can I reschedule? And they're like, well, he doesn't have availability for 8 weeks. And then I realized, man, this is going to take a long time. I've got 27 months in combat, and I got a lot more than one event I got to process and work through.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the end of my experience with the VA. So I was just kind of like, my ex-wife was like, well, I realized you're not going to counseling. I said, well, they've canceled the second appointment on me. There's nothing I can do about it. So we just started looking for other alternatives for treatment. And I basically went down the rabbit hole of treatments, looking for a better way to kind of help myself. And, my wife ended up inviting a gentleman to the sheriff's office in Florida. She was in senior level administration work, and they had this gentleman come in. He's a retired lieutenant colonel out of the Army, and he was doing leadership training. So she kind of shared a little bit of my story with him. We ended up going out to dinner, and of course, me being a retired out as an E7, him being a lieutenant colonel, it's the proverbial butt sniffing, who's this guy, that kind of thing. But he ended up inviting me to a leadership weekend in Tampa, Florida. And I went begrudgingly, but I figured I needed to do something, try to reconnect. I know there's a lot of vets in his group. And the first person that I had met at that weekend, I'm literally, they're all inside talking, and I'm sitting out on a picnic table, isolating by myself, which is typical PTSD behavior. And this Air Force vet, Tom, comes out, and he just starts talking to me, and he doesn't know me, he doesn't know my story. And he starts telling me about this organization that he's connected with that's doing some pretty remarkable things in the area of PTSD. Of course, I'm listening, right? Listening to every word he's saying. Of course, I'm not offering up anything about me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on that weekend that, literally um, the instructor just stops in the middle of, I mean, there's like 40 men in the room and probably about 10 of us are vets. He looks right at me and goes, Dan, you look like you have something you want to say. And I just blurted out 22-0. I was like, yeah, what's that? So we're losing on average 22 veterans a day to suicide. We're going to take it to zero. Didn't know how, but
Yeah.
that was kind of the genesis of the 22-0 movement. And of course, everybody's looking at me like I'm crazy, but I've got this idea in my mind, and I'm going to find some way to kind of help out my buddies. And because for us, two deployments, I mean, we're losing more to suicide than we did in combat. So for me, it's
100%.
extremely personal. And let me back up a little bit. It was in 2013, March 2nd, is when I'm literally looking at a rifle in a room in my apartment in Fairbanks, Alaska. And I'm like, I was so sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that was after my Afghanistan deployment. And then as a leader in the military, I mean, how do you even ask for help? The moment you self-refer, and now all eyes are on you, and you're now this broken piece of equipment. And so suicide became the option for me. And a couple things happened. Very grateful. I heard the kids in the apartment above me running across my ceiling, their floor, and that kind of took me out of that state. And I'm like, well, that'd be the dumbest idea ever, put a high powered rifle, through a
Through the
floor.
floor. Yeah.
I didn't want to hurt a kid or a family member, or a parent. So
Hmm.
I just kind of like, shrugged it off. And then the next morning, I had gotten a phone call from Ryan, who was one of my riflemen in Afghanistan. And he's like, hey, Sergeant Jarvis, did you hear about Corey? Of course, whenever that question's asked of
Yeah.
anybody in the military, there's one of two things. Somebody's either in jail or they're dead.
Yep.
And I'm like, no, buddy, what happened? He's like, he shot and killed himself last night. And I just remember, I kind of buried my head in my hands. And I looked at my rifle and I was like, holy crap. I said, what would that have done to a unit to lose two guys the same night,
Hmm.
And, I always say Corey saved my life. Unfortunately, it's when he took his own. So that week, we were preparing for memorial service, and I saw how it affected the men. And I'm like, there's no way I can go out this way. I can't give permission to one of my guys to do this. And I don't want to bring any more pain than what they're already experienced losing one of their buddies. So I just kept going. And, for me, I did a lot of self-medicating with alcohol. I would,
Hmm.
get such high anxiety, and then all of a sudden you're drinking a 5, 6, 7 beers, and next thing you know, you're getting more calm and relaxed because it's a central nervous system depressant, and it's actually working to bring the anxiety down. But the whole time is you're never getting to that REM sleep cycle that you need to process emotions. So
Hmm.
I did that for like a solid year after my deployment, and it's very physically damaging. It's unhealthy, and you're left depressed most of the time. So that was kind of what kind of brought me to trying to find solutions. The VA diagnosed me in 2017 with post-traumatic stress disorder with major depressive disorder. And the only thing I heard in that entire conversation was disorder. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not looking for labels, and I'm not looking for meds. I'm looking for solutions. So, and it was after that, that after that weekend, I started the nonprofit. I was just kind of diving into alternative treatments, and, you know, being able to send somebody to somebody that can actually help them. And then fast forward about 6 months, and the gentleman, Tom, the Air Force vet, says, hey, we're fixing to do a training out here at Albuquerque, New Mexico. We'd love for you to come out and observe it. And that's for that new process that's available. So I go out there, and it's a program, the Research and Recognition Project. They're a 501c3 out of Corning, New York, and they developed a process called the Reconsolidation of Traumatic Memories Protocol. It's called RTM protocol. So I'm literally listening to the whole first day of this training, and mind you, I'm an ex-cop. I've dealt with PTSD for a very long time, and not to mention stuff that occurred in childhood. And these guys are making some pretty bold claims. And I'm like, the second day we're on a break, and I go to Alan. He's the lead trainer for that. And I'm like, you guys are making some pretty audacious claims. And he goes, yeah, we are. And he said, but it's real. And I said, well, if I'm going to have anybody go to somebody that can perform these, the skill, I want to experience it first. I want to at least test the waters and see if it's legit, before we send somebody to them. So he was like, hey, you want to do it when we come off break in front of the class? So Cop Brain was like, oh, heck yeah, let's go. Giddy
Yeah.
up. About to show 25 mental health counselors that this guy's full of himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get up there, and in that process, it starts off like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're actually talking about it. So it's exposure on the front end, and then the moment you have the trigger, they stop you. That's called a break state. So they get you out of the emotions, they reground you, and then they run a visual kinesthetic process where you're literally disassociating from the emotions and events. And what I mean by that is they use a movie theater setting where you create a picture before the trauma started where you were safe, and then you drain the color, you make it black and white, and then you put it up on the big movie screen, and then you're up in a projection booth and you're looking down at yourself in the theater watching this movie. And they do that enough to get you kind of comfortable and relaxed, and they try to keep you, they don't let you watch the movie after that initial trigger. And then when you're comfortable, they have you go back into your body and then walk up to the movie screen and jump into the last scene, and then they do a rapid rewind.
Mm-hmm.
And the visual kinesthetic disassociation is actually, that's not something that's new. It's been used in the world of neuro-linguistic programming for phobia cures for like frogs and heights and things of that nature. It was put together in the early 1980s, but actually probably existed in the 50s and 60s with the folks like Virginia Satir, Fritz Perls, Milton Erickson, some of the giants of psychology were doing this stuff. It just nothing, when they all passed away, that it all died with them. They never, formally, moved it into that culture. So you go through that rewind, and then there's a part on the backside where you're doing what's like an alternate ending, or you're changing the outcome, and then you're feeling a different emotion on the outcome, and then they have you talk about it again. I remember, because when I started telling the story, I triggered pretty hardcore, which didn't expect at all. Here I am, this ex-cop drill sergeant infantry guy, and I'm getting emotional in front of 25 people I don't
Right.
know. And then after that rewind portion and that rescripting, they tell you that, all right, now tell the story again. And I was telling the story, and I kept waiting for the shoe to drop, and I'm not feeling those old emotions anymore. And I remember I smirked, and I looked at Alan, the trainer, and I'm like, dude, what kind of Jedi stuff is this? And half the class is laughing and half the class is crying. And from that moment forward, we were supporting that organization, you know, fundraising, getting therapists to take the training so that we could connect folks to them directly. And this went on for a while, and then the pandemic ended up coming along, and it kind of changed everything for most nonprofits for a good while, because all of the money dried up, and then we couldn't get anybody trained. So then we started going back and polling some of the therapists, and a lot of them weren't even using it. So they were just getting the free training. Some were using it, and we had one gentleman down in South Florida who was literally charging $3,000 up front, because he was getting his money on the front end versus over time on the back end. And we had sent him a veteran, and he turned her away. And I was so livid because we paid for his training.
Oh,
And
wow.
so that was like, man, I was just getting so fed up with the clinical world of licensed mental health counselors. So we got together as a board, and we're like, how do we, because I started digging in after going through that. I went down the NLP rabbit hole. I went and learned as much as I could. And then I just realized, I was like, we could do this without, funding therapists. We could literally train veterans and first responders to do this, so that it could be applied on a peer-to-peer level. So that's what we did. We went back and basically recreated the wheel, and went back into the works of NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. A lot of people may know Tony Robbins. He's probably one of the biggest names in NLP.
Right.
He's made a pretty large fortune doing it because of the rapid transformations you can make with people. So after developing our own, we call the trauma resiliency protocol. That's kind of our visual disassociation piece, because we didn't do any content. We stayed out of the details. So like RTM is an 89 line script, right? So you have to go through 89 lines to get to the final outcome, whereas we're at like 18 lines, and we're getting probably better results, because one, you're not having to go into the content, and two, being that it's peer led, the biggest part of it is rapport. And of course, therapists may take 6 to 8 weeks to get what they call therapeutic alliance with a client before they can really dig into trauma work. Whereas a vet, it takes 5 minutes. If you're talking to another combat vet and you've been in the same theater, you trust each other, because you've been there, you've done that, you've
Mm-hmm.
experienced the same thing. So there's a deep trust with and even in the first responders, if you're a firefighter with another firefighter, or a cop with a cop,
Mm-hmm.
that's the key, is that because all you got to do is get them to do the visuals. They don't even have to believe that the processes will work. So, and I've had people say, well, I don't think this is going to work. And of course, my reply is, well, good thing for you, it's not faith healing. You just do the visuals and your brain is going to do it for you. And the look of confusion that you see on the face of people is priceless. I
Mm-hmm.
love working with the analytical folks because they're the ones that have the hardest times understanding what's going on. And the cool part is it's just neuroscience. All you're doing is doing a series of guided visual imagery, almost like a guided meditation, and you're literally detaching the neural pathway from the amygdala to the event to the emotion that's attached to it, because you go into this negative feedback loop. The amygdala activates and opens, that's the triggered emotion flooding in, and then it just keeps cycling through the hippocampus, back through the amygdala, through the hippocampus, back through the amygdala, and you keep triggering. And that's the PTSD, that's the fight or flight response. So when you actually get the visuals correct, and all it is just simple pictures, images, black and white, disassociated movie, rewind, and then next thing you know, that amygdala is not opening because it's no longer attached. The neural pathway is no longer attached to the memory and to the emotion. And that's a process called memory reconsolidation. So the brain will literally start processing after you do that first big disconnect. So they got to get into sleep cycle, because the real key is REM sleep. So if you once you get them into that REM sleep, the brain will then start processing even more over time, because you'll still have a lot of work to reconsolidate. Even if you don't feel the emotions anymore, the brain's still got to process all of those images into your long-term storage. And then once that's concluded, you don't feel those emotions anymore. The triggers shut off. The vagus nerve, doesn't activate every time you don't want it to, and you can stay more calm. Your cortisol levels go back to normal. And then obviously with regulated cortisol levels, the likelihood of developing autoimmune disorders or diabetes or cancers or strokes or heart attacks is significantly diminished, because that's the stressor, that's the big killer. So we just started doing data collection, and we have Dr. Pam Arnell, who basically gets all the pre and post scores, because you can see the way the brain is reacting by doing the 20 question survey. It's the post traumatic stress disorder checklist version 5, which is
Mm-hmm.
standard across the industry. We do the PCL 5 20 questions, and you score 0 to 80. That metric, roughly about 31 to 80, is considered PTSD. And there's a lot of people maybe they'll score out as a 72 or 73, and they'll do 1 or 2 sessions and they're scoring out 0. In other words, all of those neurological symptoms are no longer present after 2 weeks. And that lets the person know that, okay, something has shifted, it's changed, behavior's changed. You're sleeping, you're not having night terrors or night sweats, you're not having dysregulation of emotions when you don't want them, you're not looking at your blind corners when you're walking around a building, or you're not triggering when somebody drops a book or slams a door. That just shows you that fight or flight mechanism is actually shut down. So it's pretty cool to watch it. I love the blank stares you get when they're like, what just happened,
Mm-hmm.
where did it go? I've always been able to feel this. And two, I think the big benefit, without getting into content, one, the coach doesn't have to hear the stories, which can be extremely gut wrenching, because I've heard some stories that I don't know how therapists sit there and listen to people tell their trauma constantly. I guess they have to figure ways to dissociate themselves from it, but
Right.
some of them are extremely brutal stories. And then to not have to hear that, and not only that, the person that you're working with may have some things that they don't ever want to share with anybody, which is part of the problem for them to even get help, because I think they're going to have to dig into it. It could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be domestic violence in the home, it could be anything that they don't want to share. And when you tell them that they don't have to share that information, they really get this look of like, are you serious? They're like, yeah, let's get it. Because I'd say 70% of the men and women we work with that are vets and first responders, it started in childhood. Because even when you're looking at people with high ACEs, which called adverse childhood experiences, people with
Mm-hmm.
high ACEs have higher propensities for developing post-traumatic stress. And that's standard across police, fire, EMS, military. whether therapists have a lot of stuff because we always seek those positions to try to help other people, and it all starts in the childhood.
Right.
But it's crazy to actually watch somebody go through that healing process. It's actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah. No, I love it. You hit on about almost all my questions right there in the start. I just wanted to, I think your perspective is pretty unique. You're Army as well as police officer, you're in a leadership role. In your time in the military and police officer, did you see lots of opportunity to get help? You touched on it briefly, but I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more.
So perceptions are that you can't ask for help in both, right? Because as
Mm-hmm.
a leader in the military, and I was guilty of this before I had my own problems. Suck it up, man. What's your problem? Let's go. Rub some dirt on it. That's kind of the general consensus, specifically with the male dominated cultures. And because we don't want to say, hey, show people that we have weakness. And when I had my problems after Afghanistan, because half my guys got medevaced out of country, half of them were injured. One of the guys in our platoon was killed that I felt very responsible for. And then at the end of my deployment, my mom passed away. So I literally, that was my mom dying for me was like what sent me into my spiral.
The catalyst. Yeah.
So it's like I was doing okay with a loss, with guys not coming back to the fight, guys getting seriously injured. And then when my mom died and I had to go home and confront the funeral, all of the guilt, because she was a diabetic with complications. And my thought process was, well, shoot, if I hadn't been in the military, would she have been under so much stress? Could she still be here? All of those things ran through my head.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I get back to Alaska, that's the self-medication part. I stepped on a pressure plate. I detonated an IED that was about 5 feet away. It was late July of 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't sleep after that. So my brain was never hitting REM sleep cycles. I wasn't processing anything. And the alcohol is what brought me down. The alcohol let me actually pass out. Problem is, you don't really get rested sleep when you do that.
Right.
So you're still waking up with all those same issues. I mean, I'd wake up in just torrential sweats, because your body's literally fighting all throughout the night. You're having the night terrors and nightmares. You're reliving a lot of those experiences, and your nervous system is just going crazy. So for me, I was like, I contemplated: do I self-refer? Do I do EAP? Do I find a? And then I just realized that any way it happens, somebody in the chain of command is going to find out. So if I go through EAP and the Army's paying for it, they're going to
Right.
know who they're paying for.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was that was a big fat no. There was no real accessibility. But and you might have commanders who would be very understanding, but it's the perception that we interpret inside of our brains that don't allow us to ask for help. So what I did after that, when I realized how much I was struggling, and then we had the suicide after Corey's suicide, like if I saw one of my guys struggling, I'd say, let's go. And I would drag them down to mental health and make them go talk to somebody. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to take the burden of responsibility away from them from asking. And it kind of became a joke. Oh, so Jarvis is taking another one down to mental health. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the guys actually more appreciated that
Yeah.
than they'll ever admit, because now they could go dump some things and then not have to worry about being judged for it, because people are just knowing Sergeant Jarvis is overreacting. So, and in law enforcement, it's even different. You have a badge and you have a gun. You have authority to detain people and take away their freedom. So anything when you're dealing with post-traumatic stress, they look at it as a psychological issue and a liability issue.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that, which is why nobody wants to get help. Now, a lot of agencies are starting to change, because let's take police as a profession. All right. In a 30-year career, a law enforcement officer will be experiencing or exposed to 188 traumatic events. That's the general consensus. So 188 critical incidents in 30 years. Their civilian counterpart may experience 2 in that same time frame. So with those heightened levels of cortisol and operating in the fight or flight all of the time, that's why we're losing so many, not only to suicide, we're losing more to suicide than line of duty does, police and fire.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also, heart attacks are extremely high, strokes are high, your cancers are high in those professions. A lot of them ended up succumbing to, during COVID, during the pandemic, but that's because they're working with compromised immune systems. See, the body has two defense mechanisms. All right, it has an external fight or flight, an internal immune system. The moment your body triggers into an external fight or flight, guess what shuts down? Your
Mm-hmm.
body's immune system, because it is no longer the priority. So you're having people in professions operating with weakened and suppressed immune systems. And they might be doing things like self-medicating, because I know a lot of law enforcement officers will drink just to sleep. Same thing with firefighters, because you're operating with high anxiety. And I'll give you an example. We got connected with a fire department in Florida, and I won't mention the department, but I worked with a lieutenant. He had a big tent event on a trauma and dropped to a zero within like 20 minutes. So he could no
Mm-hmm.
longer feel his emotions. And his eyes go wide. He goes, "Please tell me this works with the kids." I'm like, "Oh, kids are so much easier than adults. They actually follow instructions a lot better." So I ended up working with his daughter. And after that, he started sending firefighters to us. And then we trained one of his firefighters, because he had such a profound shift. He wanted to be part of the solution. We're actually going to be going down and training 13 of their firefighters on their peer support team. But as of date, we've already worked with 30 of their firefighters at one department. The department's only got 158 people. So 30 out of 158 were operating with PTS. They're
Right.
operating at levels that would have qualified for post-traumatic stress. So we're seeing the same thing in law enforcement. We do trainings. We're law enforcement agencies with a peer support team. Worked with the sheriff's office in Central Florida. 13 employees came to the training. We do the test on the beginning. We test out whether they are neurologically. 10 out of the 13 qualified for a PTS diagnosis, and they're working every single day.
Every
So
day. Yep.
every day. So like there's no off season. We deploy, we come back, we're down for a year, sometimes maybe 2 or 3. Now they're not even, you may not ever, there's guys in the ranks right now who have never deployed.
Right.
And great, that's good, that's awesome. It's the way it should be. And then next thing you know, these police officers are finding themselves getting into trouble because they're triggering and they're reacting with the individual public how they would have reacted 5 years ago at a bad incident.
Mm-hmm.
So we're able to go through and work with these guys and girls and disconnect all of those old triggers. So you can literally cut the ties on all the neural pathways of their anger problems, of rage problems, of shame issues, sadness issues. You can go to the roots of those emotions. And that's a different process than the trauma work. And you can literally reframe those root emotions, and then the brain will neurologically separate from that emotion. So now you won't even feel that emotion anymore unless something else were to happen. In that
Right.
moment, after you do the disconnect, they go back and they're like, "Oh, I can't feel anger anymore." Anger is one of those things, even anxiety are those things that you could think about doing something tomorrow that hasn't happened yet, and you're triggering that emotion. So when we do that neural pathway disconnect and we have them go to a future event that they would typically get angry or anxious over, and they can't find it, that's when you know you've updated the operating system. That's the brain, or I call the brain frame, that computer between the ears. So it's really cool. It's really powerful. The goal for us, I want to train as many peer support organizations as possible, just so we can, stop seeing this epidemic of suicides.
Right.
For me, I know our unit that we went to Afghanistan with, our we had 2 deaths in combat in country, and we've had about 5 suicides coming home.
Yeah.
And that's unacceptable. But of course, the Department of Veterans Affairs, they keep doing the same thing, expecting different results, and they will not look outside of the box at all.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, they're a point of frustration for me.
Yeah, what you were talking about earlier, the help that you received from the VA was very similar to mine. I got, I think, 4 prescription medications, all of them at the same time I didn't really agree with. So it really impacted me on a mental level. So I ended up having to stop all of that. And then reaching out to get the, I guess, therapy. It was a real pain in the ass, because I think 2 times my appointments got canceled. I have friends that have reached out just recently within the last 3 to 6 weeks, and one of them was suicidal extremely. And they're like, "Yeah, we can get you an appointment about 10 weeks from now."
Right.
And he's like, "I need help today." And I pointed him in your direction. Hopefully he reaches out. But let's see. The other thing is that I notice is with police officers, you probably have a better perspective than me, but I was talking to one, and this person identified as having some sort of mental issue, and their supervisors were aware of it. And instead of getting help, they forced this individual to resign
Right.
because it was a safety liability. And that's
Right.
what they were
That's,
saying.
that's the consensus in a lot of your agencies. Now, there are some departments, I know some chiefs that are absolutely will not let somebody go for that because then it sends a message to the whole rank and file.
Right.
But I worked at an agency where they don't look at PTS as they say they don't have a problem with it. And they're really fooling themselves if they don't, if they
Yes.
don't believe that that's a real issue. We had a major at our agency. He's got 3 bosses ahead of him. He worked homicides, child sex crimes. He was begging to get out of that. He'd been in there for years, begging to get out of that. Everyone knew he was an alcoholic. And then when COVID hit, he just said, you know what? I'm done. And he resigned. He was in the deferred retirement option plan. He could have worked another 3 years and walked away with a couple $100,000 in his bank account. But he was so overwhelmed and done that he just quit. And in March of 2020, he had a suicide attempt. And then he got help with another organization. So he got connected with somebody. And that's the big thing is connection. He got connected. He found a little bit of purpose again. And then he put out a video and he was afraid to ask for help. Now put yourself in his position. He's only got 3 bosses.
Yeah.
He's got 3 people above him all the way. He's got the chief of law enforcement, the undersheriff, and the sheriff. That's it. Those are the only 3 people he reports to. And he was afraid to go to those 3. If that major was afraid to go to anybody for help, what do you think the rank and file below them feel?
Exactly.
Same thing. So, and the problem with that is, I get it. You got to have a functioning officer to patrol the streets. They look at it the wrong way. They look at it as a psychological deficiency when it's psychology's got nothing to do with it. You can develop psychological problems over a long-term period of time with PTS, but PTS and anxiety itself are neurological. It's just the neural pathways that have the vagus nerve activating repeatedly, and that limbic system just kind of gets hijacked. You can't even control it for some of these folks. There's like zero control to it. You know, guys will drive through an intersection. Next thing you know, they're triggering. They have no idea why. And then they go back and examine, like 9 years ago, they worked like a traffic homicide at that intersection.
Yeah.
The brain just says, okay, danger, danger. The saber-tooth tiger is now approaching me. I need to go into fight or flight. All right. That's all PTS is. So if you could be traumatized that quickly, why can't you be untraumatized that quickly? And that's what we're seeing is actually you can be untraumatized faster than you have been traumatized. You know, we're seeing people with histories of chronic complex PTS that was like years and years of child abuse. And in 4 hours, you know, worth of work, they're not feeling it anymore. And it literally resets the entire central nervous system. And then some of them get mad because we had one who was in therapy for 2 decades, 20 years for PTSD. She was going once a week, and therapists didn't do anything but have her talk about it. Nothing, no success, no successful outcomes, but insurance kept getting billed. And then she does 2 hours worth of work with us, and she's like, this is ridiculous. Why did my therapist? And that's when we have to come back and say, well, one, your therapist doesn't even know this exists. And if you told them, they're not going to believe you anyway, because they're taught inside of a box. All right. This term called evidence-based treatments. Evidence-based was something that came out of probably around 1992, and it was exploited by big pharma, you know, go figure. And it can take up to 5 to 17 years to get a process in that evidence-based realm. Well, where's the innovation going to come from in a world like that? Most organizations can't survive that long, you know, without some kind of successful outcome. But for us, we're a 501c3. We don't need the term evidence-based. We see what's going on. We fix the problem. And my buddy Nick calls our process success-based. And it is. Outcomes are successful every single time. We've never had a fail. Now, occasionally you find somebody with a personality disorder, and it's a little bit different because, you know, borderlines, histrionics tends to be a lot more dynamics going on underneath, and that these will work on them, but many of them thrive on that response that they get from a trauma outburst. So we don't typically allow our coaches to work with somebody in the cluster B. They really need to be in therapy because they have other issues going on other than just PTSD. But if it's just PTSD or anxiety or anger problems, it's an easy fix every single time.
So I wanted this show, I like to have the individual, if you're comfortable sharing, like what catalysts kind of let you know that you needed to get help, that enough was enough. Like, because I feel like, I went through a phase of this is normal. It's okay to be an asshole after war. And then, I did the self-medicating. uh, the things that you said about the alcohol really resonated with me, because that's true. Like, wake up in the cold sweats and always sleepy, always tired. But eventually it led to a point where I was like, I got to get help. What was that for you?
So a unique thing happened to me when I left military service. I married my wife we're divorced now, but I married her after military. So she didn't get to experience that part of my life. And when I went back into law enforcement after combat, I got normal again, which was really weird. I know now why. It's because law enforcement officers operate fight or flight every day.
Mm-hmm.
So just by putting uniform on and going to work, my brain was operating the way it was used to operating in the fight or flight. So I felt normal. I didn't feel like a fish out of water. It's kind of like we come back from a deployment and then everybody wants to go back to war because I felt normal over there. They don't feel
Yeah,
normal back there.
I did that
So
for sure.
yeah, absolutely. It's why a lot of guys get into contract work, because while they're operating in Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever in the world in that fight or flight, they feel normal again because they're operating the way they're supposed to. You take that operator or that soldier, Marine, whatever, and bring them back stateside, and there's no fight to fight. We're fish out of water. We don't know what to do. So guess what? We're fighting one way or the other. Whether we get into mixed martial arts or whether we go to the bar and we get into bar fights. I mean, look at the justice cause, Asian veterans. There's over 150,000 that have been incarcerated since 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Really bad decisions that got them, into a lot of trouble. And so for me, it was when I left the sheriff's office the second time, when I was like, because I have sciatic nerve issues, I got spinal stenosis, and that duty belt was killing me. Pain on my last 6 months, I was in chronic pain like 24/7, and that's when I decided, it's time for me to step away. Being 42 years old, chasing 19-year-olds through the swamps of Polk County just wasn't a good use of my time.
Mm-hmm.
And when I left, probably about a week and a half after I left law enforcement, that honey-do list got finished. And then I had nothing but time on my hands. That's when everything kind of spiraled again. So, like, the nightmares and night sweats were coming back, the night terrors were coming back. And my ex-wife, she was like, "What's going on?" She didn't know. She was clueless. She had no idea. And so she asked me about my experiences in combat, and I really didn't want to tell her, but so I shared some stories with her, and her eyes just got really, really big. And I'm like, "What? That's not normal." It was normal for me, and
Yeah.
she didn't know how to handle it. So she's like, "You're gonna have to get help, or I am, because I don't know what to do." So that was for me, not wanting to screw up my marriage. It ultimately ended anyway, but that was part of, I when I was in a fight or flight state constantly, I was a different person. And then when I healed and I didn't have that fight or flight response anymore, I changed as a person. You can't
Yeah.
not change. I like who I have become because I feel a million times better. But we peacefully ended our marriage, and I'm very grateful for her, because I would have never been on this journey had she not said, "Hey, let's go out to dinner with these people and go to that weekend." And
Yeah.
one of the gentlemen I met on that weekend, he's on my board of directors. He's my best friend on the planet, and I'm actually living like 8 miles from him right now in Georgia. So I made some solid relationships, and then building out the nonprofit. Basically, 220 did not exist before April of 2018. And since we've started, and especially since we started going down the NLP work with vets, we've worked with over 50, probably 5,200 people. And not all are vets, not all are first responders. We will work with spouses, family members, we've worked with kids. And then we've been getting a boatload of civilians requesting help because they're seeing what we're doing. So
Right.
it's really kind of cool. I mean, I know we've got vets who were actively suicidal, who have literally gone on to get married and have kids. So you won't even see the benefit of that, because that's going to be rippling out for generations. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole goal is we want to go out of business. We do not want to be needed. We don't want to exist. We want to be irrelevant, which I think is what sets us apart from a lot of nonprofits. Everyone's afraid of relevancy, and we brace the irrelevancy, because if we get to the zero missions completed, we give that gift to the world, because that's eventually what we want to do. Eventually we'll get the evidence-based, backing, and then just open source what we do to the whole planet. We
Right.
actually, we've trained folks. We've trained a therapist in Australia. Her son was an Australian combat vet. She's working relentlessly in Australia with their vets and first responders. We had a social worker from an orphanage in Kenya reach out, and we trained 4 of their social workers. And their orphanage had 28 kids, and we've got the data, the pre and post data, which is remarkable. So we're able to impact, other populations throughout the world. This isn't something that's unique to first responders and vets.
Right.
Trauma it's a global problem. Ukraine's going to need it at some point. And the cool part is the folks in Kenya translated it into Swahili. So which
It's neat.
that proves that it's just a process. It's not the specific language. And it's getting, how do you get that person to do a picture before, a picture after? How do you get them to make it black and white? How do you get them to look at themselves watching a movie? How do you get themselves to rewind? So
Hmm.
it doesn't really matter what language you put it into. It's something that can benefit all of humanity. And that's ultimately going to be the goal.
Right. So in addition to NLP, it sounds like you went from isolating to you have a pretty solid support structure. You went from being a police officer, which in my opinion is very purposeful. It's a meaningful lifestyle, but you've transitioned into the nonprofit 220, which is not only a purposeful purpose to life, but one of the other things that it really does is it's giving back to the people that you care about, which is also helping. Is there anything else that you did in your life to, I guess, new habits, breaking old habits? Is there anything you stopped doing, things you started doing that helped raise the quality of your life?
I would say probably the biggest benefit was stop drinking alcohol. It
Yeah.
was a huge benefit, because you just feel better. You're not getting depressed. You do have to change some of the old habits. Sometimes you got to force yourself out of your comfort zone. That's really important. Folks, men and women with post-traumatic stress typically go into isolation, especially guys. We like to isolate, right?
Yeah.
So you got to get out of those comfort zones. But here's the really cool part is once the trauma's gone and you get all those neural pathways disconnected, then the real possibilities are out there. What can I do now?
Hmm.
And it's kind of funny because we've been trained. We probably trained 150 vets to do what we do, but we don't have 150 active coaches because a lot of them will come to us with PTSD. They'll go through the training and they'll literally heal during the training because part of what they have to do is work on their own stuff with another coach in the training.
Hmm.
And then they're like, you know what? I've always wanted to do this. And then they go do that. It's like, you don't have to do the training. We'll do that. We'll fix you without that. But it's kind of ironic. It does force people to change. Like you can't help but change when you drop the anchor to those old emotions. It literally gives you a whole new future.
Right.
Yeah.
So now we're just gonna hit directly on 22-0. So how does someone help? And who are you all looking to impact? Because I know you touched on first responders and veterans, but you're also working with civilians too, because it is a societal thing, I would believe.
Yeah. Well, the nonprofit focus, the mission is anyone who puts on a uniform for a purpose higher than self. So police, fire, EMS, military, active military, National Guard, reserves, anybody who's in those categories. We work with crime scene technicians for the police departments. We work with victim advocates. We work with dispatchers. You name it. Well, if you put a uniform on and that purpose is something bigger than you, that's who our audience is. Now, we do want to grow out into other groups like my buddy Nick and I, we've talked about. We would love to put on like a summer camp for kids, like a trauma camp. Bring 100 kids in that have deal with trauma and then send them home a different child, because children are so quick and so easy to heal. And then that's another area we want to work on. But yeah, it's something that everybody deals with. Everyone knows somebody who's got anxiety. Everyone knows somebody who's got trauma. And the goal is just to get people back to being healthy, so that we can have healthy interactions as a society. You see what's going on in the schools these days. And these kids that are triggering, they just got put through 2 years of a pandemic and we're expecting them to be normal.
Hmm.
It's not going to happen overnight. So we do want to affect, we've already trained therapists who work with like children in foster care. We have one therapist in inner city Baltimore, and she works with some of the worst females that are getting ready to age out of foster care that were survivors of human trafficking and just some of the worst abuse that you might have ever heard about. And she's having such an impact. And initially, when she got trained, she went back to her bosses, and she didn't even have her license yet. She was under supervision, and their bosses were like, "Yeah, we can't use this. It's not evidence based." And then the boss says, "Well, let's just do one, and I'll watch." And that was it. Once she saw it, now she's got the psychiatrist saying, "What are you doing to these kids? Because they're getting them off their medication." Their worst of the worst is now back doing cheerleading. And she had been isolated and basically schooled outside of the system since she was 6 years old, and she's like 15 now. Now she's going to high school, and she's thriving. That's the remarkable thing is, we want to impact a lot of those disenfranchised communities that really really need the help, because I mean anybody can look at what's going on in the country right now, and it's kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
We got to put it back together.
Yeah, I think teaching mental health practices, positive mental health practices to children is it would be one of the most impactful things you can do, because you mentioned on it earlier, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And me personally, what I believe is that teaches a young one, when they're developing a negative pattern of behavior of how to deal with stressful situations. So if you're able to cut that off early, then it stops, systemic problem in that individual's life for the rest of their life.
Absolutely. And the thing about the ACEs information, there's so much data on ACEs. They can go back over the last 20, 30 years and see people with these high ACEs back in the early stages, and say, if you scored 6 or higher, you're probably not going to be alive after the age of 55. And that's fairly accurate data without intervention. So we got to find ways to intervene with these children, so that we can get them healthier. Look at law enforcement, right? So 188 traumatic events, versus 2 of their civilian counterparts. And, their average age of retirement is 62 for most cops. And the average age of death is 62 for a lot of police officers. So they're living 20 years shorter because it's the same thing. They're just under stress all the time. So if we can get in and intervene, you have a 20-year-old police officer who shoots and kills somebody. If you can intervene then and reset that nervous system, they stay more baseline throughout their career, and they stay healthier, and their families stay healthier, their kids stay healthier, because trauma is cyclical. It does cycle through families. The actions of a dad is going to affect their kids. The actions of a mom is going to affect their kids. It's just the way it is.
On average, how long does it take for someone seeking help with you all to get contacted by a coach?
So the moment we get, hey, we need help, we put out a call to action to our coaches, and they're typically connected that day with somebody. And then the coach works out a schedule with a person. Sometimes they've come to us, and then within an hour, we're running a process. Hey, or it's going to be within a day. So there's no 2-month waits. There's no 2-week waits. It's literally like, if you got the time, we'll make the time, because we actually pay our coaches to work with the vets. So there's an interest for them to work with them, because they're going to get compensated, but they also get to help them. So it's kind of like, that was the way we had to scale it because we had such an overwhelming response. With volunteers, it's very difficult to keep people engaged. So the moment we started paying the coaches, it was kind of a no-brainer at that point. But yeah, they're typically within the day they're connected, and they probably have an appointment either that day or the next day.
How much does this process cost for an individual seeking help?
So if a veteran's seeking help, we have a really good deal going on. We never charge a penny. So it's free to the vets. It's free to first responders. And what we'll do is, because we got a couple foundations that are supporting that.
Right.
So we get money from the Oz Valley Foundation, the American Legion, state of Florida, their nonprofit project, Vet Relief, funds that kind of stuff. So there's no cost for vets. There's no cost for first responders, dispatch, whatever. If you're a mission essential, there's no cost. If you're a dependent of that, it depends on what coaches we have available, because we pay for the coach. We pay the coaches. Right. It might cost $125 for a spouse. But if we have coaches that just finished training, they owe us 20 clients, and we can typically put those in so that they don't have to pay for anything. Right. And then civilians, we charge $250. and that pays their coach, and then it pays for 1.5 sessions of somebody else. And we haven't had a single civilian complaint yet.
Right. Uh, how can others help you all? Whether that be sharing a link, sharing a Instagram, donating, supporting. Like how do people get involved to help you, or coaching?
Yeah, so if you meet our criteria for coaching, right now we're pretty full up on the coaches for the veteran side. If you are a first responder and your agency has a peer support team and they want to bring us out, that would help us because that keeps the doors open for us because the agencies will pay for the training. If you have somebody who is struggling, maybe start listening to our podcast. Let's share those podcasts with people. We have a documentary film that we released called Healing the Heroes of 9/11, The Way Forward, where we took 5 first responders, 4 from Ground Zero, 1 from the Pentagon, who for 20 years had PTSD, and then we captured their stories, which were absolutely amazing. That's another way you can support us even financially, because I think you can rent it on Amazon Prime for like $1.99, or you can buy it for like $4.99, and that would help get the word out. Or I mean, we have a free link. We give that out too, so you could YouTube it or Vimeo it and pull up the free link. Just sharing that information, because we've had a lot of people watch the documentary and say, "I didn't know you could heal PTSD," and I was like, "Well, big pharma may not want you to think that way, and your therapist may not want you to, but we can."
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good way of letting them go through a transition. Because when you follow the story of these first responders, I mean, they're just crazy stories. And then their healing part, you start coming back and seeing how they're sleeping and how they're not triggering. It kind of gives people hope, and then people will reach out. So you can share our mission. I'm on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook and Instagram. I'm not really active on Facebook because we kind of got stalled out on growth after the second year. I'm not sure if that's because of shadow banning or what. Or maybe it's just because I'm 51 years old and I don't quite understand social media. But you can just share the messages with the world, and get help at 220.org is the website or the email address. And that'll go to my assistant, and Jessica will have you connected to a coach. If she gets it that day or the next day, you'll be assigned to somebody pretty quickly.
Awesome. That's all my questions, and I really appreciate you jumping on here. Is there anything you like to touch on in closing?
Yeah, I just want you guys to know that if you're listening to this and you're struggling, you're not alone. Right. Most of our coaches, we all struggled at one point or another, and now we're thriving. And Viktor Frankl calls it kind of logos therapy. The ability to help others helps us. So for me, it's best therapy on the planet to do a session with somebody, because at the end of that hour or 2 hours or however long we're on, sometimes 20 minutes, you see that release. It's that oxytocin release, that trust molecule. It's just so rewarding to see it. So just kind of join us on this mission and help us to end this epidemic of suicide, and just kind of meet us up on the high ground.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up there. I really hope found something useful in there. If you see this as a resource that you could use, or someone that can use it, shoot them to the show notes, and all the links are provided in there. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Hope you all have a good one. All right.